Hello, in this video I want to talk about gray matter versus white matter. So you've probably heard of gray matter and white matter before, and you know that we can find this in the brain and spinal cord. And you probably know that gray matter is gray, and you probably know that white matter is white. But I want to talk about why gray matter is gray and why white matter is white. So when we look at nervous tissue and we see these areas of gray matter and white matter, what we're really looking at are regions in the nervous system that either have a high concentration of neuron cell bodies or a high concentration of neuron myelinated axons. So let's quickly review the structure of a neuron. So here we can see a neuron. It has a cell body or soma that contains the nucleus and most of the other organelles. And then it has several short branches coming off of the soma, and these are called dendrites, and it's the job of dendrites to bring a signal into the neuron. And if we're talking about a multipolar neuron, which we see here, then we have one single long axon, and the axon carries the signal away from that neuron. Most of the axons in the human are myelinated, meaning there's this layer of fat around the axon. So white matter is white because it contains mostly myelinated axons. And the myelin is fat, and fat tends to be white or light in color. Whereas gray matter is gray because it mostly contains cell bodies and dendrites. Cell bodies are very dense. There's a lot of stuff inside of them, in other words, all of those organelles in the nucleus. And this makes them appear darker. The more dense something is, the darker it is. So gray matter is gray due to a high number of cell bodies. So over here in this histological slide, we can see gray matter and white matter. Now this slide has been stained purple, so it's not actually gray and white. But what I like about this slide is that it shows you how in the gray matter, there's a high density of cell bodies. And those are the purple spots we see all over the place, the darker purple spots. On the white matter side of this slide, you see very few dark spots, meaning there are very few cell bodies. Instead, you can see these little white patches all over the place, and those are sections through myelinated axons. Down at the bottom here, we can see a human brain, and a small section has been removed from the brain, very clearly showing the cerebral cortex, which is gray matter, and then the cerebral medulla, which is white matter. Now I want to talk about two new terms, nuclei and tracts. Okay, so gray matter in the central nervous system can be found in really two types. It can be found in layers, like we see in the cerebral cortex, or the gray matter can be found in like groups, which we call a nucleus for singular, nuclei for plural. For example, in the hypothalamus, we have several nuclei, which are groups of neuron cell bodies. And each nucleus in the hypothalamus has a particular job. Maybe it's acting as the thirst center or the temperature regulation center. So a nucleus is a group of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. Now, because neuron cell bodies are capable of processing incoming information, in other words, they're capable of producing graded potentials and possibly starting action potentials, the job of gray matter and the job of a nucleus is to process information. White matter in the central nervous system is found in groups called tracts. So really what this is saying is that when we look in the central nervous system and we see white matter, what we see there is bundles of myelinated axons. And we call these bundles tracts. For example, in the spinal cord, we have ascending tracts which carry information up the spinal cord. So the job of an axon is to carry action potentials. So because white matter and hence tracts are made of axons, their function is also to carry action potentials. Now, when we look at the peripheral nervous system, we use a different term for bundles of axons. In the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of axons is not called a tract, it's called a nerve. And I think they do this just to make us angry, right? It's the same thing, it's the same road. You'll have the same axon in one tract and its equivalent nerve, but we give it a new name in the new location. So for example, when we look at a cross section through the brainstem, we can see that there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves attached to the outside of the brainstem. Each of these nerves is continuing on inside the brainstem, where we call them tracts. So let's take a look at the oculomotor tract and nerve. That's cranial nerve number 3. Right? The tract is located inside the brainstem, and it's composed of bundles of axons carrying action potentials out of the brain. Once we actually get out of the brain, though, it's now called the oculomotor nerve, and the oculomotor nerve carries these action potentials to the musculature of your eye so you can do things like roll your eyes. Another example would be the optic nerve and the optic tract. So the optic nerve carries action potentials from your eyeball towards your brain. At a structure called the optic chiasma, the right and left optic nerve meet, and then some information crosses over from right to left and left to right. But at that point, these axons enter into the brain where they're now called optic tracts. So nerves are in the peripheral nervous system and tracts are in the central nervous system. Now, just like we had an alternate term for a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, we have an alternate term for a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So instead of calling this a nucleus, we call it a ganglion. So a ganglion is a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And these groups of neurons are working together to perform a particular function. Right? So let's go back to that example of oculomotor nerve and oculomotor tract. It turns out when we look at the oculomotor tract, we can see an enlarged area where the tract begins, and this is called the oculomotor nucleus. So a nucleus is a group of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. Okay, so that's an example of a nucleus. But to look at a ganglion, we have to look in the peripheral nervous system. So I want to show you the example of something called an autonomic ganglion, because this is one that comes up quite a bit in this class. So if you look in the top part of this picture, we can see a brain and a spinal cord and a heart. And then between the two, we see something that looks like a snowman made of 4 circles instead of 3, right? Those circles are actually representing ganglia. So inside of these ganglia, we're going to have groups of neuron cell bodies. In an autonomic ganglia, there's communication between 2 neurons, and this communication is important for controlling things like our automatic body activities like heart rate. So let's take a look at what's inside of an autonomic ganglion. So we can see that there is a cell body here, and this cell body is going to be processing incoming information. In the picture here, I just showed one cell body, but in reality, a ganglion will contain multiple cell bodies.